recently got some feedback from a second editor on my book for Coven and Crown, so I wanted to share with you what some of her feedback looks like and some of her tips for me as a new author that will be trying to get traditionally published soon, in case it helps you out as well. I did get permission from her to make this video and talk about her feedback, but she did a professional beta read for me. Now, on her website, she calls that late stage developmental edit, and defines it as a professional overview of the manuscript's structure, characters, and story, and brief advice regarding marketability. No proofreading or line editing, so it's not exactly how each sentence looks on the page, it's more of feedback for your overall story. Her feedback for me was centered around 3 things, so we're going to talk about those. I'm also going to talk about her tips for starting the traditional publishing process and trying to query and get literary agents. And I'm also going to read a couple things from the manuscript of her suggestions and how to fix things and what my sentences look like, so you can get an idea of what editors do. Her feedback centers around these 3 things for my story: foreshadowing, grounding us in the setting, and the Act 3 structure. Now, she said something about foreshadowing that I have not read in the 14 books that are sitting on this shelf right next to me about writing, that as soon as she said it, it was like a light bulb went off on how to make it better and how to implement it in your story, so I'm going to share that with you. Regarding foreshadowing, she said, start with the rule of 3. Mention or hint at a thing 3 different times in 3 different contexts as a way to foreshadow it properly. She had made at a comment that I made a mention of it in the first act, and it was during a battle. So she says you need to mention it 2 more times outside of the context of a battle. You also don't want to mention these things too close together or too far apart. I only had 2 mentions of this thing in my book, one at the beginning and one at the end, and there's too much time in between for the reader to be able to connect that. And she said your reader needs to go back and all the clues should be very obvious to them upon rereading. Like, oh, I should have seen that, or how did I miss that? But instead, with mine, it was just like, oh, I guess that's here. I guess that's something. So I didn't hint at it enough, and there was too much time between the little crumbs that I was dropping. So, rule of 3, mention the thing, the person, the whatever that you're, trying to keep secret 3 times and space them out properly. Now, grounding us in the setting, the second thing that she mentioned for me, is pretty self-explanatory. She said by the end of the book, she still didn't really know what the castle looked like. She said, I got an idea that the climate is spring, or I know that it's spring, and there's trees and crops, but other than that, it was fairly vague. And she put that fantasy readers want to be transported into a different world, so to make that more immersive. I just got done doing about a 1.5 to 2 week world building for another book that she's actually going to edit for me later. So I feel like I can bring that into this book and make a more interesting setting because it was kind of vague. The third piece of advice was on the Act 3 structure, and the biggest thing was that my darkest moment for my main character came too early, and it needs to hit around the 75% mark right before you kind of go into Act 3. So she made some suggestions for how to move some scenes around to where I didn't have to do a full rewrite. I could just shift some things, and then it would make the dark moment hit at the right part. Story structure is very important. There's a lot of different story structures out there. I originally plotted this with Save the Cat, which is a 15-beat structure, and because it's been through so many revisions and changes, that structure kind of got away from me a little bit. So she attached a beat sheet to her feedback to help me get everything back in place to make it fall in the right order. So you're not going to be able to read this, but basically it's a chart like this to help me get all the beats in the right place. And I knew it was going to be off because my word count is already too high. I'm going to talk about that in a second. So I had asked her for suggestions of where I can cut down words, what she thinks can take the, get the acts basically. I'm also going to talk about that. To help get my beats back to the right place. Since I told her I was looking for places where I can cut my words down, she left some feedback in the document on the actual book. So here's an example of where to cut words. She said, watch out for places where you repeat yourself. So I'll read you the line in the story and what she's talking about. For context, Ravenna came home to the keep. She's the witch queen. 2 other witches were fighting, and she basically told them to stop fighting. And then all the other witches in the coven are looking on. They're anxious to see if those 2 that were fighting are going to be disciplined. So the line is, A few heads nodded, and the twins' shoulders slumped, likely in disappointment at the lack of a physical punishment. The bloodthirsty pair loved a good show. She put in here, the twins are disappointed, and you can explain why they're disappointed, but anyone can understand that someone who wants to see corporal punishment is someone who is bloodthirsty. Watch out for places where you're repeating yourself. So even though I like those two lines, they do kind of say the same thing, just in a different context. So she made that comment multiple times where you can say it and show it, but don't repeat yourself and you'll be able to cut words. She suggested gutting my entire first chapter and starting with the second chapter because that's where more of the action begins. And I told her, I was like, that's like a gut punch to me. I have reworked that chapter so many times and I really do love it. But she is right because there's a little bit of action, there's kind of planning going on, but there's more action in the second chapter. So as much as I love that first chapter, and as much as I've worked on it, you want to start with more going on, and I just didn't have enough to make that sustainable to garner or to keep readers' interest. So I'm going to have to say goodbye to it. But I want to say a brief thing about this too. If you're getting feedback from somebody, specifically a professional, you might think like, oh, they're going to tell me to change all of this, and they're going to tell me this is bad and that I should get rid of this, this, and this. And just remember, you don't have to do anything if you don't want to. It's just suggestions from an editor. However, I think you should go into it very open-minded because these people know what they're talking about. They know what they're doing. She has specific experience with the publishing industry. So I put my feelings aside. I look at it very objectively. And I had told her that I'm very open to criticism, so tell me what I should do and I'll do it. And I'm going to implement probably every single thing that she said, even though some of it is hard, like getting rid of my first chapter, but I want this to be successful. I want to learn from people who know more than me, and that's what I'm trying to do. And I would recommend that for you too. Remember, you're the author. You don't have to do anything if you don't want to, but if you're going to pay for editing, I think you should really make sure you go into it open-minded and willing to accept someone else's criticism and feedback and actually implement it. So let's talk about the traditional publishing advice that she gave me in here. I told her that I wanted this to be a duology. Ideally, I think it would work best. That's how I've planned it. I set the book up to be a duology, so the story wraps up kind of in the first one, but it does end, with a setup for the second book. And I knew going in that as a new debut author trying to query that you should really do a standalone around 100,000 words for my genre. My word count was already too high, and I'm trying to do a duology. So I don't want to shoot myself in the foot too much by doing things that are obvious, that are not recommended. So I'm going to work on my word count, get it down. And she also suggested that because this is a very crowded marketplace right now for NA fantasy, she said selling a series is extremely difficult. So, in this beat sheet that she gave me, she made a suggestion for how I could make the ending to this book feel complete enough to sell as a potential standalone. I asked her some clarifying questions about that, and she said, have your two endings written, the duology ending and the standalone ending. So, if you query and an agent asks you, what does this other ending look like, you have something to send to them. But as much as I really, really want this to be a duology, I like her feedback about writing an ending as a standalone and starting with that. So it hurts because I'm going to say, okay, this can be one book, even though I have such cool ideas for the second book, but I've already got too high of a word count, and like I said, I don't want to shoot myself in the foot by starting out wrong, so I'm going to make this go as a standalone, and I'm just going to have to wrap it up and query with that, and we'll see how it goes.